Well, hello to you all. Lovely to be with you for our Sunday message on Ganubi Methodist Online. A few years ago now, in a small town, I had to go and buy some milk. I was approached in the parking lot by a very sorry-looking chap who literally cried, telling me how hungry he was. So I asked what he needed. He just wanted some milk and pap. So I bought him a litre of milk and a bag of pap, and I added a loaf of bread and some baked beans to cheer him up. When I handed him the bag, he just stared into it for a good few seconds. Then he looked up, tears all gone, and with a note of irritation said, "You should have got a 2-litre milk, and I'll need 50 rand electricity to cook the pap." Well, at that point, my compassion failed abysmally. I think I suggested that he use the rest of his tears on another person for the rest of his grocery list. Well, our scripture for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. And the title of today's message is Compassion That Never Fails. May the Lord bless his word to our lives. By this time in our passage, Jesus' popularity had grown rather large. And so our passage begins with Jesus taking a boat across the Sea of Galilee so that he could find a space to be alone, to grieve, and to pray. Jesus had just learned that John the Baptist, who was also Jesus' relative through Mary, had been beheaded by King Herod. But even before Jesus reaches the other side, the people had caught wind that he was heading in their direction. But we read in verse 14 of our passage, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And so the first point I draw from our passage is God's goodness. Here, in Jesus, we see the astounding goodness of God. Jesus himself is grieving. Jesus wanted to be alone. And yet, when he notices the large crowd waiting for him, he didn't get frustrated, annoyed, or angry. He didn't ask his disciples to tell the crowd that he won't be seeing anyone today. No, Jesus sees the crowd, and there's a single emotion that grips him: compassion. Later we read that there were about 5,000 men in that crowd. So if we still add the women and children, this crowd was huge, probably over 10,000 people. And Jesus spends the entire day healing their sick. This crowd had a pretty large shopping list. But with deep compassion, Jesus takes care of every case that came to him. This is the goodness of God, the God who chooses not to isolate himself even when it is our evil that has broken his heart. This is the God who sacrifices his personal comfort for the sake of those who desperately need him. This is the God whose compassion never fails, the God who will never chase anyone who seeks his goodness. In fact, Jesus promised, "Whoever comes to me, I will never drive away." John 6, verse 37. It has nothing to do with who we are or the kind of problem we have. It is the goodness of God that will ensure he receives us with open arms. This is our God. He is all good. His heart is always towards us. We can come to him always with everything. And so we should. The second point I raise from the passage is God's grace. After an entire day of ministry, verse 15 says, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. It was getting late. It was getting dark, and they were out in the sticks. So the disciples suggest to Jesus that that was enough for the day. The crowds would have finished the snacks that they had brought with them, and they'll be getting hungry by now. But instead of sending the crowds home, Jesus tells his disciples to feed them. Okay, a crowd of over 10,000. How does Jesus expect us to feed them? It will take a miracle, his disciples may have thought. But hadn't they been watching Jesus do miracles all day? And this was the point Jesus was making. Yes, it was getting dark. Yes, time was running out. Yes, they had no resources. Yes, the problem was beyond their ability. But Jesus wanted to teach his disciples that they should also trust him, that they too were needy, not just others. Grace is God's compassion to do for us what it is impossible for us to do for ourselves or others. Jesus wanted his disciples to realize that we all need God's grace, and that God will give grace to those who trust him. And in God's compassion for us, he will challenge us so that we will seek his grace and find it. When life gets dark, when we are exhausted and run down, when time is running out, when we can no longer cope, when we don't have what it takes, when we reach the end of our tether, that is precisely the position the disciples were in. And when we're in that position, what Jesus is wanting is for us to turn to him, to trust him for grace. He is the one who works miracles, not us. In our helplessness, Jesus is challenging us to surrender our control. And don't we love to be in control? In favor of trusting him for his grace to us. He's urging us, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. Jesus would later tell one of his most well-known followers, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. This is our God. His heart is always towards us. We should come to him always, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. That's Hebrews 4, verse 16. And the third point is God's gift. All that the disciples could find was 5 loaves and 2 fish. Hardly enough for themselves, let alone the hungry masses. But Jesus tells them to bring the little they have to him. A bit like the example of the widow's mite that Jesus uses. And then we read in verse 19, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Jesus receives what they had, and he does a miracle with it. Not only did the whole crowd have enough to eat, but there was enough for each of the disciples to take their own full doggy bag home. God's gift is always much bigger than the sum total of what we can offer. If only we will give him what we have and trust him for the gift, however it comes, which as with the disciples, is usually different to what we expect. Because when we bring what we have to God, God brings about the miracle that would have been impossible for us. This is God's gift. And not only to us, because the miracle of God's gift is in its multiplication. When we offer what we have to God, God miraculously multiplies what we offer. And God's gift will not only bless us, but will also bless the lives of untold others. Mordecai Ham. I wonder if you know that name. Well, Mordecai Ham offered himself to God as an evangelist. And at a small meeting back in 1934 in Charlotte, North Carolina, God touched the life of a 16-year-old boy through Mr. Ham's preaching. That boy was Billy Graham. God multiplied Mordecai Ham's small offering to bless multitudes through Billy Graham. Oftentimes I think to myself, but you really have nothing to offer. And then there's that gentle reminder, you are right, but offer to me the nothing you have, and then leave the gift to me. If we are prepared to offer to God the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that we have, we can entrust the gift, the blessing, to God, whose compassion never fails. In a world where compassion is so scarce and where even the compassionate can only do so much, it's hard for us to comprehend unfailing, undeserved compassion. But then Jesus came and showed us the God of unfailing, undeserved compassion. He is the God of compassion who sacrificed his own comfort and came to our world to be God with us, the multitudes who are sin-sick and dying. He is the God of compassion who gave his own body to be broken, his own blood to be poured out, so that by his wounds you have been healed, says 1 Peter 2:24. When we had nothing to give him, he opened his arms of compassion and he gave us his goodness, his grace, and the miraculous gift of life in abundance, life eternal. When we reach the end of our abilities, the end of our resources, the end of our support system, the end of ourselves, the end of our lives, and we finally come to Jesus and offer him the nothing we have, that is when we begin to experience the miracle of the God whose compassion never fails. God bless you.